Welcome to Rules of the Game podcast. I am your host, Butch Porter, and we are in the library of Dodona Manor, the George C. Marshall's home in downtown Leesburg, Virginia. And with me is the one and only Tony Howard with the Loudoun County Chamber of Commerce. Welcome.
Thank you, Butch. Yes, Tony Howard with the Loudoun Chamber of Commerce. It's great to be with you today in one of Loudoun County's most treasured historical assets, the Dodona Manor, the George C. Marshall International Center. It's just a wonderful place to be.
It is a great place to be. We love doing it here. It's a lot of fun. So how long have you been the president of the chamber?
So I started here in August of 2006. So I just passed my 14th anniversary.
I didn't realize it'd been that long because I joined the chamber in 2005. So I only had 1 year with Randy Collins.
Mm-hmm.
And
good man.
Yeah, definitely good man. He went on to bigger, bolder, and better things out west, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've been there ever since, man. That's a long time. So I've been a member. Yeah, I've been a member for 15 years. It's crazy.
Well, thank you for your membership.
Time flies.
Thank you.
Time flies. So how are things with the chamber? I know that in-person events have been compromised a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm a member of a lead share group locally, and we started meeting in person I think we've had our third. I think we started in the second meeting in August. So we've only had like 3 in-person meetings. So tell me what's going on in the chamber from a event standpoint. How's that?
Sure. Yeah, so
going?
We spent pretty much the entire last 6 months pivoting, as they say, adjusting to the new reality. And so,
if there was a bullshit bingo type, that word would come up a lot these days. Right?
It might.
Everybody's pivoting.
It might. And
I can't blame them.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying the rules on language for this podcast. The Chamber of Commerce is a face-to-face business if they're in person. There's no replacement for showing up type business model if there ever was one. And there are plenty out there that are that way, certainly. Healthcare workers, first responders, you name it, restaurants to a certain degree.
No replacement.
Entertainment. So there's no replacement. So we're not the only ones, but we've had to pivot. We've had pivoted almost exclusively, on the front end, very exclusively to virtual platform, Zoom. That's the terminology.
Sure.
That's the term everyone uses. Even if they're on another platform, they say
they're like
Zoom.
The new Kleenex. They've
Frisbee and
locked
Kleenex.
down the brand. Yeah, it's wild.
And so we shifted rapidly. We worked really hard to get content and good content online. We tried to shift the existing plan for 2020 towards the virtual platform. So the things we planned on doing live, they're all live, right? Planning on doing in person and bringing it online. We had to try to shift that when there was new content because, early on, and you may recall there was serious confusion around some of the economic recovery and crisis response things that were coming out of Washington, subsequent to come out of Richmond and in Loudoun County and Leesburg. Recently, even Leesburg's gotten into the game in terms of redistributing CARES Act funding onto our nonprofits and our businesses. So kudos to them for that.
That's been fun.
So the education aspect, educating our members on what all those programs are about, how you apply to them. Do you qualify? Do you qualify for PPP versus EIDL?
Sure.
When March dawned, I'd never heard those terms before, and now they get repeated in my sleep. So
yes,
that's most we've been up to. So you mentioned the lead share group. We have started to see some of our lead share. We're 13 lead share groups. Some of them are transitioning to
There's 2 or 3
person.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Ours being the biggest, boldest, and baddest and greatest.
Well, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah,
sure.
Right, that's obviously
true. Except for all the others. Yes, that's true.
Whichever one you're at. Right?
Whichever I'm talking. Yeah, I shift my position based on the audience, but
that's right.
They're starting to return. There's there's basically 2, if you will, schools of thought out there. There's those out there that are really hankering to get back to normal. Everyone's hankering to, but really want to get back to in-person, human-to-human contact, even if it means 6 feet in a mask.
Sure.
And then there are some who are just still very, very reluctant, and they may or may not have, underlying health issues, or loved ones do in that case.
Sure.
But there's still just that reluctance because, this is a this is a medical crisis, an economic crisis, but I think there's a psychological scars that will linger based on our experience in the last 6 months. And
it'll be interesting to see which it does the most damage. Looking a year from now or 2 years from now, 10 years from now, how much damage is going to be caused by. I mean, just even from a physical medical standpoint, the number of annual physicals that are skipped for 4 or 5 months because the early detection of some diseases and things like that. I mean, there's no telling what the overall costs are.
Sure.
But it's hard to calculate those things, right?
I believe that it is. You know, you have anecdotally, you can have some evidence of folks
Sure.
who are experiencing medical distress but don't want to go to the emergency room because they're afraid of what they might get at the hospital because that's where all the COVID patients are.
Yeah.
That's real. Our
is.
healthcare officials are telling us, but you know, is it significant in numbers? I don't know.
I think what's interesting is that, you know, I mean, Loudoun, we've had like 120 deaths, give or take, and maybe a little less, and
I believe it's in the teens, but
yeah, 117 or
yeah,
something like
16,
that.
17,
Because we had several days without any, and what is it? 104 of them were over 80, or I mean, something really ridiculous like that.
I used to know the stat, but in the over 70, there was about 90% of them. And
Yeah,
over
about
80
90% are
about
over 80.
80%.
So, I mean, to me, not that I'm a medical professional, and you're not either, but so we won't pontificate on viral loads here on ROTG. But I mean, there might have been a better way to handle, you know, the
we can Monday morning.
Yeah, that's
Monday
what I
morning
mean. A year
this,
from
yeah.
now, 2 years from now, I think we're going to see that it might not have been. I mean, do you think it was a good idea to delay for 2 weeks like we did? Like, in other words, when we opened up in
back in May,
early
June,
May,
to keep
early
Northern Virginia
June.
behind.
Yeah, we had a 2 week delay. All these businesses were ramping up to get started again, and you know, 25% capacity phase one or whatever, and then they were told like almost at the last minute. You know?
I think at the time it was a tough call, and
Yeah.
I think it's arguable as to whether it wasn't. If we knew then what we know now, then I don't think it would have been warranted because we would have known what practices to keep in place.
And everything's
diligently
2020.
keep in place to make sure that
hindsight.
our businesses could operate safely and effectively. But at the time, you know, it wasn't yet so inculcated into our cultural acceptance that masks and social distancing and all those best practices, it was starting to emerge, but it hadn't really been so ingrained in our minds day to day. How many times it is an online meme? You've left your car to go inside the store and you're like, darn, I forgot my mask.
That's right.
What am I, a superhero? You know,
I was telling somebody the other day, I was going to a Rotary meeting, and you know, I'm like, it used to be I just had to have three things.
Yeah,
you know, I had to have my keys, my wallet, my phone. And, you know, and back in the day, it was just keys and wallet. Like phones, I mean,
you're not old enough to remember
basically
that, but I do.
knew. I didn't get a phone until 1998, and that same year I decided not to ever have the ringer on. So people call me all the time, and I don't hear it because, you know, it's easier not to have to worry about silencing and things like podcast recordings. Like if I were to just pull an example out of a hat. One thing I did learn from my science fiction exposure, which is very important, in the first month of COVID, is the difference between viewing and seeing. Because there was this really good book called The Naked Sun by Asimov. It was one of the robot books. And so there's this planet, and I had to go back and read this book in the middle of COVID because I wanted to get some knowledge on how to handle yourself in a world where you don't actually come in personal contact with another human being for several months. And so they distinguish viewing. Viewing is when you see somebody on the screen.
Sure. And
seeing is when you actually see them in person.
Makes sense.
I started making that distinction lately. Language is a wonderful thing, Tony. So what do you think? Do you think the next year will be? What do you think was? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict, but what does the next year look like from a business standpoint, from your point of view? What do you think that? I mean, do you think that we get through this in any semblance of normalcy, or are we talking 3, 5, 10 years before we even see the ramifications of this? So
I'll preface my response by saying no two businesses are created equal, no two industries are created
true.
equal. So I can list several. I just got off a budget meeting and headed over here with a government contracting committee. And so a lot of government contractors haven't seen anything. In fact, they haven't been able to do certain things like travel and conferences and meetings because of restrictions due to COVID, but they still have the same contract. So if you're in the data center business and if you're constructing data centers, you're in the construction industry in the data center space, you haven't slowed down recently. Now, all good things will come to an end, it's just a matter of when. One of the things I noted early on about this virus is how unfair it is. I know it seems really illogical to describe a virus, a non-sentient being as feelings. But just think about it from a medical perspective, how it does strike the elderly, folks with comorbidities or existing morbidities. It does seem to hit minority communities. You know, the percentages, I don't know if Loudoun County breaks it down this way, but in Fairfax County, somewhere between 40 and 45% of all their patients were from Hispanic heritage.
Actually, Virginia, if you look at the minority issue, Virginia is the Hispanic population that's been hit the most.
And I think
by a long shot, like by a order of magnitude.
Yes. Almost, so some of the theory there is that they have a lot of frontline hospitality jobs and other jobs in which they had come in contact with the public
early on,
and so that's one of the reasons. So it was unfair from a medical perspective. We all now. I believe we all better understand that now and come up with solutions.
I think we do have a better understanding. Yeah.
It's also been unfair in terms of how it's hit certain industries. So hospitality, tourism, restaurants, retail, particularly local retail. If you're online retail, you're singing pretty. Amazon.
I did want to add. IT server managers to the list of heroes, right? In other words, I mean, those guys got to keep the Zooms going, or bad things happen.
But to get to I guess the heart of your question is, when are things going to get better? I think it's definitely going to linger into 2021. We already get there. It's going to linger into the second half of 2021.
Do you think some of that is politics and some of that is the virus itself and the ramifications of it, or is
it's an all above question?
It's all of it.
Yeah, and so budgets are wrecked. So, and they're going to remain wrecked. So, for a lot of businesses, so service providers, they'll feel a lot of it too as well, depending on the industry and their focus within that industry. But I think budgets are going to be, they're already hurting, and they're not going to get better soon.
Yeah. What kind of conversations are you having with commercial real estate types about the long-term implications? My wife works for a company in Falls Church, and she hasn't seen the office more than twice since it started, and she's done everything out of the house. And actually, a couple of months ago, they said, hey, you can come in once or twice a week, we'll stagger it and everything. Nobody comes in. They don't need to. They're getting everything done remotely. I mean, what is a city like New York or even downtown D.C. or even Reston? Are people going to still pay those rents when they don't really need it anymore because they're getting stuff done and not fighting the traffic?
So that's not an easy question. It's a complex answer to that for a couple of reasons. So,
sure.
There have been some surveys done of workforce, actually younger workers, and you might even still qualify for that description, Bruce.
No,
I no longer do.
No, I'm the
are hankering to get back to the office.
Loud and over 40 is where I land.
The 400,000 over 40.
That's right.
It's you and me.
That's right.
So a lot of folks want to get back to the office. It's a key part of their social identity. This is where they socialize. It's where they consider their friends.
But they don't have to.
And but they want to. They want
sure, but the owners may not feel they need to, and so.
And there's those that don't. There are those who would much prefer, and I'm experiencing that with my 10 employees. The folks that let's be. I'm back at the office mostly because
I still can't believe you guys do what you do with only 10 employees. It's always impressive.
Thank you. Well, I'm competing with my wife and son for Zoom bandwidth at home, and losing. So I went back to the office, but it's my youngest workers who are there.
Sure.
Part-time, meaning like not every day, so I think we'll see it there. And I'm glad you asked that question because it kind of teased me up for a program we're going to have in October. Thank you very much. I'm going to slam dunk.
Least I could do.
So we're going to have the Director of Economic Development for Loudoun County, Mr. Buddy Reiser, as well as a gentleman by the name of Dr. Terry Clower. He runs the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University. Okay. He's the preeminent economist for the D.C. region. And so we're going to ask those questions. We're going to ask them, what is the future of office? What does it look like? Will the demand be there? What's the impact on mixed-use environments? Because that was a place that Loudoun County decided to make a lot of bets because it brought people together. And so live, work, play, right? Remember that?
Sure.
And
I'm a fan to a point. I think sometimes it can be forced, right? I think if you're forcing live, work, and play, if everything has to look exactly the same, another live, work, play, mixed use community, I think. And what happens is 10 years later, and this, they come back and say, well, we need twice as many residents as we thought we did, right? And what does the county do? They pull their hair out because, residents cost money and businesses make money for the county coffers. So I think that's going to be a challenge. I mean, the good news is it's only office space, right? So the other businesses in mixed-use communities, the businesses that will suffer in the short term in commercial districts, possibly. Like if you're in a commercial district and those if nobody comes back or a lot less people come back to commercial centers that don't have a strong residential base, then those businesses will suffer. The retail businesses that feed them lunch every day, that park their cars and all that's going to stink. But I think if you the live, work, play thing can work. It's just more living and less work. I think I think there's a possibility that our overly sized houses might get even a little bigger because every business, every house is going to have an office, right? And so, and not just like one we can make into an office, but like an office because, mom, dad needs an office.
Yeah, very likely.
I doubt that any HOA covenants are going to be, I'm sure they'll make some adjustments. Like, remember back in the day when Lansdowne was being built and they had these really strict covenants against home-based businesses and, the home-based daycares and blah, 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 blah. And so some of that's out of date already. It's been out of date for a while because people work out of their house all the time.
I wouldn't assume that they are. Most of those restrictions are based on visitor trips and vehicular traffic associated with such.
Some of them make those distinctions and some of them don't.
But if you're working out of your home and you're not necessarily generating a whole lot of visitor trips and vehicular traffic up and down neighborhood roads, HOAs aren't going to care or maybe even know.
Well, but when they do, they usually do something. And,
sure.
I mean, and so that's what happens.
Yeah. You don't like HOAs, do you?
I'm not. I don't have a fan. I don't have a problem with HOAs. I did pick my neighborhood based on the fact that there wasn't one.
Yeah,
so there's that.
Thank you.
I'm one of the few neighborhoods in Leesburg that doesn't have an HOA, and I'm very happy with it.
How revealing.
If you saw my yard, you would know. You would know why that is. It's best for me not to have an HOA.
Right.
But no, I mean, I'm not picking on HOAs. I'm just saying that there's a lot of kind of rule. And the town has zoning regulations against certain number of trips in certain neighborhoods, et cetera, even without an HOA. Yeah. I think, since a lot more of our business is done over the interwebs with, you don't have couriers coming in all the time with documents as often, right? I mean, that problem is being abated. But I think if you have less people working in commercial centers and more working out of their houses, then I think that can be good for the live, work, and play thing, right? And it can also be bad for the income part of it, because what happens is that a lot of the income that's coming in from businesses may go somewhere else, and they're still paying the residential. The residents cost money, and explain that for the listeners. Residents cost money, and businesses make money.
I'll start by explaining.
You can explain it better than me.
That I don't believe it's true.
Okay, you don't believe it's true.
It's a false dichotomy because it's.
You mean the people work for businesses and? Yeah.
Well, okay. What's a house? The house is where a job goes home to sleep at night.
Sure.
And so businesses support residents by providing jobs. Residents support businesses by spending money at said businesses, depending on what the business is. And so they're all part of the same ecosystem. So to create that sort of firewall between them two.
They can be, but it's just a lot of people are commuting, right? I mean, even if you have live, work, and play, people are still going to commute, like at least before COVID. Now they don't have to, right? But and
it's not they can be. They are. Okay?
Yeah, that's right.
And so you wouldn't have the businesses here in many cases if they didn't have the workforce. And the workforce needs a place to live, right? You just talked about having a house, not an HOA, but you have a house, so you have a place.
That's right.
I do. Our cameraman does, right? And so we all have jobs and pay. Those businesses pay business taxes, and so and they're paying business taxes in many cases to the county of Loudoun, the town of Leesburg, and other incorporated towns here in Loudoun County because the jobs, the businesses are located here. But so are the residents. And so my point is, it's all part of the same ecosystem. When folks try to, what I believe is artificially segment one from the other, I think they lose the big picture and are making a serious mistake.
Yeah, but do you think...
And I'll get to the question of workforce housing here, not because you asked, but because I wanted to.
Because you want me to. You should run for office.
So if we want a thriving...
I'm going to answer the question I wanted you to ask. But...
That is an old trick, and I'm employing it right now shamelessly.
I'm going to call you Donald.
We need to have more affordable housing in our community for workforce that are making, let's pick a metric, 120% of AMI or below as a household, right?
Sure.
Or maybe it's 80% or below.
Whatever the
we can draw
is.
the line someplace, but you know what? We have some wonderful gated golf course communities here, right? But those aren't the places where the folks who
have HOAs, so I don't live in any of those communities.
If they're washing your car or serving your meal or fixing your car, let alone washing it, or putting a roof on your house, it's like skilled, in many cases, even technical positions, things that require education and certifications in order to be proficient at that job. So we're not necessarily just talking about the proverbial blue-collar job, really. They're tech-collar jobs in many cases. Good jobs. Teachers,
people who know how to do things and will survive the apocalypse.
Yeah, teachers, firefighters, cops, the whole 9 yards. There's a lot of those folks, they actually form, a majority of the workforce here. But if they are not able to afford to live in the community where they work and live, it creates transportation challenges because they're on the road longer. Creates retention challenges, so we're replacing them more frequently. and it's creating quality of life challenges too as well for that workforce as well as for all of us.
Well, and this is where I've over the years had challenges with, and I'm not going to pick on HOAs. I would never do that. But the whole preserving real estate values versus preserving, property rights, if you will, right? I mean, there's that balance. So sometimes in Loudoun, we're always obsessed with how much our house is making, and then when the how much the value of our house is increasing. But then when we hit this huge dip in the market, which was 2006 to 10 or whatever, it was really kind of brutal. So that's some of what we do from a zoning standpoint inflates housing costs. Like if we restrict building and less than 20 acres in half of the county, that may be good for the environment and may be worthy of doing, but it does make it harder to find a house and make it more expensive to find a house.
Some folks use the term exclusionary zoning.
Yeah, that's the term.
I'm not sure
it's a term.
It's a term. I'm not sure it's adequate to address all of our Loudoun County situation, but it is true. So what you're basically saying is that, we don't want workforce housing. We want housing that's below the average cost in this neighborhood or in this area.
Sure.
It's only reserved for housing that costs more than the average throughout this jurisdiction. That's exclusionary, okay?
Yeah.
And so, that's something that the county has to take a hard look at, and the chamber has advocated strenuously. We feel like they could have created more workforce affordable homes in the transition policy area, which is not in western Loudoun County. It's actually in eastern Loudoun County. It's a transition area between the two, right? They didn't necessarily need to add millions of units or even hundreds of thousands of units, but a few thousand units would have created the supply necessary to keep overall costs down, but also provide sufficient so that, again, our workforce, again, good people with college degrees in most, if not many cases, can
this is
still
not a
live,
normal county, right?
can still live in our community. And, mostly because the cost of living, yes, you talked about, we do fixate. I know sometimes I do, on the assessed value of our homes. By the way, it means nothing until you sell.
That's right.
It's just like gold and stocks too, is what means nothing until you sell.
Sure.
So just ride it, just consider it a place to live until you do eventually sell. But that type of attitude that's pervasive to the zoning policies that we have here in Loudoun County can do some good, but also I think do some less than good.
Well, sure. No, I think there's been a lot of, in my opinion, there's a lot of damage done by overly controlling, exactly where we want people to live in Loudoun County, right? If we want them all to live in the middle of Leesburg, we want them all to live on 28, and we stack them and pack them to, with the dreams that a train's going to eventually come to Leesburg, which it will, probably never happen.
Not there, not that time.
Not now. I mean,
come to Leesburg. Yeah,
let's
get it to Ashburn and just be content for a period of time, okay?
I was not a supporter of the Silver Line to Ashburn, so I think we spent a lot of money on trains, and I think the next few years are going to make it that much more evident that it may not have been a good idea to spend all the
trains were a transportation as well as an economic development and real estate play.
Yeah, maybe.
And no, well, it's there are still statistics that 85% of all commercial investment in the entire D.C. region is made within a half a mile of a metro station. Now, that stat's going to be a year or two old, and it's not COVID reflective. So,
isn't that a little circular though? I mean, isn't it when you create something like that, the investment concentrates there, but if you didn't build it, wouldn't the investment still be there and just be more spread out, or it's at least possible?
No, it would stay in Fairfax, Arlington, D.C., Prince William. Not Prince William, they don't have Metro, Prince George's. So that's what would happen. Loudoun would not be competitive. And when we started the debate over Metro, and I were plowing old ground here.
You don't think Loudoun was competitive before?
Not for that type of commercial office, mixed-use commercial office space investment. Yeah,
pre-COVID, yeah.
Yeah, my friend Butch, if the strategy is, put data centers there, we could probably continue to make a lot of hay for quite some time.
Sure.
The county made a decision that the economic interests were important, but so were the quality of life interests too as well.
Right.
And so that's why I'm saying Metro was a complex play that will ultimately pay off. It's just generational. It's not something that is going to pay off in
but
a few years.
as soon as it pays off, it has to be replaced though, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is a cost to it. I mean, if all the projections go out to 30 years, and in 30 years you have to replace everything, then it may or may not be worth. I mean, if you look nationwide, most train developments have been. I can't believe we got off on Metro. This is so much fun.
Yeah. You're the host, not me.
Yeah. Most train developments end up with half the riders and twice the cost, right? And I don't think this will be any exception.
Silver Line was actually outperforming expectations, and the Orange Line has always been the most profitable line. And so
Orange Line was a good line. That's true.
So So I think in terms of, if you want to look at our Loudoun County's participation in Metro, it would have been beneficial. I think it's in terms of a financial payoff in other markets, I can't argue that because I'm not that familiar with the stats.
Yeah, I'm slightly more nationwide than I am, some, but I'm not an expert. I've hung out with too many transportation nerds over the years.
Over the last 20 years, DC has experienced a bit of a renaissance.
Yeah.
I moved to this area in the mid '90s, and it was struggling. And
sure.
And Metro made a key role in that, and most of it had to do with some of the developments around the Metro stations. How it made it advantageous to develop there. So it's still a benefit to the county, and so
I just think that I'm just thinking through this. As we're, I don't know what D.C. and New York City and downtown Chicago and some of these other cities might look like in a few years. But what I'm hoping is that, being selfish, since I live in Loudoun County and I don't live in those cities, that Loudoun County and as many mixed-use developments and probably more coming that we have, hopefully some of those HQs end up, here instead of, because that's the point, is the reason why I think the commercial centers will suffer is that because they cost a lot of money, and I think there will be a lot of people who decide it's not as
just think a little bit more creatively, if I may invite you to do so.
Well, I would actually have a similar comment about thinking more creatively.
Yeah, so you think about whether it's headquarter or other major office investment. If folks are looking for greenfield, build to suit development opportunities that are only available in outer suburban communities like Loudoun County than in downtown D.C.
That's what I mean.
Washington,
I think
Chicago.
we'll benefit from it. I hope.
And so I think there's a great opportunity for Loudoun County to leverage that because, again, there's going to be a certain segment of the population that don't necessarily want to go back to the office. Add on top of that a certain segment of the population that don't want to get into narrow train tubes or buses to go to those offices too as well. So it has the potential for driving up road congestion in our area. People stick with single occupancy vehicles because they feel safer that way.
Sure.
They're not going the congestion's worse. They're going to start thinking, maybe there's a better job in Loudoun County rather than in Arlington or D.C.
Sure.
Beautiful markets. I got a lot of friends there too as well. So
sure.
Don't necessarily want to exploit somebody else's disadvantage, but we have to exploit our advantage.
We do have those advantages, and I agree completely. I think if I were to add to that, and I mentioned this on the interwebs the other day, and I got into a conversation with one of our fellow chamber members about, adding to that the element of kids possibly not spending 35 hours a week for 39 weeks a year, for 13 weeks a year, trapped in an institution somewhere. I don't know if that's what's going to happen over the next year. I don't know if more families will. Right now they're trapped behind the computer, which is almost as bad. But I just imagine if you add to that those mixed-use communities, more kids in the community during the day. In other words, homeschoolers like myself and others. I think the types of businesses that can flourish in that environment. We have businesses right now, and I interview some of them occasionally. We do Education Spotlight every week or two, and they have the resources, they have the spaces to support, kids during the day. And I think putting kids back in the community wouldn't hurt us either, because a lot of these business owners like myself and yourself are also parents. We have kids and I think there's some value and I think we have a lot of opportunity in Loudoun County to, as you said, be creative. Okay, so anything else you want to share with us about future of business?
Yeah, these are challenging times, and I just ask folks to keep the faith in the entrepreneurs and the innovators, okay? Because those are the folks who are going to actually carry us forward to wherever the new normal is. And so we're going to have to adapt. It's adapt or die. And so I choose adapt. I think most people do. And I do believe that I think we're a highly adaptive species, highly ingenious. These are, there's some creative destruction going on right now, and that doesn't always feel good. I know it doesn't always feel good to me. And so I think having faith in the entrepreneurs and the innovators out there and being one yourself, if your audience could, accept that opportunity, is what's going to help us get through this crisis stronger than the way we entered it.
So one last thing, if you, every guest of the podcast has to come up with a rule Okay, so every it's called rules of the game. So every guest has to come up with a rule. So we've had lots of good rules, but if you had to think of it could be a rule for business, it could be a rule for life, it could be a rule for these kinds of conversations, it could be a rule for whatever it is. Do you have any? What's if you had to think of a rule? What would it be?
Rule. And I mean, like
any rule that you
drive
think,
the speed limit. Is that something? I mean,
no, a rule for life. Call it a rule for life. A rule that you abide by or you think is important.
I mean, I guess I'll just maybe it's because I'm getting older, so I'm going to repeat myself, but I'm going to just say what I just said a second ago.
Adapt.
Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Okay.
Keep the faith in your own ability to adapt, to innovate, to be entrepreneurial. I don't think you necessarily have to be a business owner to be an entrepreneur. You can think entrepreneurially anywhere you were planted in life, and so. Think about the opportunity to overcome the challenges that in the case of this pandemic, and there are other challenges out there. There are certainly many, a lot of unrest around social and racial justice issues. The economy certainly could be stronger.
Sure.
There's a presidential election going on right now.
No, is there?
And so there's a lot of angst in and around that too as well. But I think what I'd say to folks is, keep the faith in yourself and in those around you to be able to adapt and overcome and to come out stronger. Because you know what? I think that's the only way we actually do survive and get stronger.
I agree.
On the other side of wherever the other side of this crisis
wherever the
is.
other side of whatever this is.
Yeah.
Right?
So yeah.
So what's going on from a business perspective? What's going on in Richmond and D.C. that we need to be concerned about?
Yeah, so I'll start with at the federal level. They're still working on the next round of Paycheck Protection Program. I think that more economic stimulus is required. There's also a bill called the Restaurants Act that I believe our Virginia senators and perhaps Congresswoman Wexton support. They support restaurants and other hospitality industries, the locally owned ones.
Sure.
Too many of them are just going to go away because they just don't have the cash to survive much longer at these sales levels they're at right now. So they're just going to need the help. And you and I, government handouts are not by default our first choice, but I think they're called for and warranted in this instance because it's such an extraordinary set of circumstances.
Sure.
The Paycheck Protection Program bill is being hung up by a couple of issues. The disagreement between House, Senate, Democrats, Republicans. I know. It's
shocking
how things go. One aspect is that Senate Republicans, to their credit, are insisting that there be some immunity, civil immunity for businesses that make good faith, best efforts to keep their employees and their customers safe by practicing widely accepted best practices and safety guidelines. Face masks, social distancing.
Have the lawsuits started already? Have they?
They actually have. Yeah, there have actually been some formed already. Virginia adopted and put into place, and in fact, all businesses, including most of your listeners, are obligated to abide by the emergency standards put down by the Department of Labor and Industry, the Health and Safety Board.
Sure.
A lot of those standards were actually advocated for by national labor groups that couldn't get the Trump administration to accept those standards. And they're pretty onerous in some cases.
Sure.
And if you don't abide by them, there's a presumption of, if you will, civil guilt, that if an employee or a customer were to get COVID, it's almost impossible. You could take the entire DOD and NASA budget and you still would not be able to trace whether you got the COVID at work or if you went to a club the night before and then brought it in and gave it to your coworkers or things like that. And there's very little that employers can do to control for that.
The only thing worse than that would be to literally track our every movement and report on it, right? That would be, that's probably not going to
be a good idea for a number of reasons.
It's not gonna happen.
And so Virginia's created this environment by which employers, businesses, are at great risk if they were to open up their operations in a significant fashion because they're now liable if they were to miss, just not dot one I across one T. And so they have potential liability. That should be fair.
Yeah.
And so the General Assembly had an opportunity amidst all of the good work they did, some not so good work in areas of police reform, to adopt a bill that would provide some level of civil immunity to businesses that were clearly demonstrating best practices and were doing all they could to abide by the regulations on the books to keep it. No business wants their employees or their customers to be at risk. No business that plans on being here next month does.
That's kind of the problem I've had with a lot of it is this presumption that they just don't care.
It's a presumption of ill will on behalf of too many politicians and not all, but some labor advocates too as well. So
it's like business owners are some like aliens who just come down and they just want to pull money and send it back to their spaceship. They don't actually live in the community and also don't want people to get sick. Right?
Okay.
It's odd sometimes.
Oh, I get the metaphor. I'm not entirely certain it's one I'd employ, but I get it.
That's the way sometimes that business owners are treated when it comes to how they're regulated.
Virginia ended the last fiscal year, June 30th, with almost $250 million deficit And most of the fiscal year, they didn't experience COVID. They're going into a fiscal year where most of that year there will be in a COVID-based experience. I've seen the number. We'll see. The early estimates for the last fiscal year deficit didn't turn out to be as bad as was anticipated, but they're talking about $2.5 billion shortfall.
That's a significant
That's money
amount of
that's coming out of our schools. It's coming out of our cops,
That's
firefighters,
about a tenth
roads.
of the budget, right? Of the total budget, right?
Not quite that much.
But I thought we had like a 40
No.
billion every 2 years.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit higher than that. But
Okay.
yeah, about 40. Would that be a tenth? 4 billion would be a tenth.
It's a biannual budget.
Yeah. So 4 billion would be a tenth of that. It's about,
Give or take.
yeah. So
It's a lot of money.
I didn't bring my calculator, so I can't give you a precise answer.
It's about twice the size of Loudoun's budget.
It's a lot. We could both agree it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
And
A
guess
billion
what?
here, billion there, sooner or later.
And where's it coming out of? It's coming out of Loudoun County Public Schools, Loudoun County Sheriff's Office,
Yep.
Loudoun County Parks and Recs,
That's where it's
Loudoun
all
County
coming
Family
from.
Services, Loudoun County Department of Transportation and Capital Infrastructure.
Sure.
Economic, you
Yep.
get the picture.
Oh, yeah.
Leesburg,
It's a lot of
Percival,
money.
it's coming out. That money is not going to flow back to Loudoun or to our other communities because it's just not going to be there. Well, how could they help rectify that situation? Help businesses reopen safer and sooner and put people back to work safer and sooner than what they appear to be trying to do otherwise.
Yeah.
And so it's a, the term cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes.
They
absolutely.
say they want one thing, but to do something that actually affects the opposite change is illogical. I'll leave it at that.
Illogical. My gosh. Yeah.
And I hate to sound like Mr.
God.
Spock, but I
God
self-edited the term I was going to use in that instance and decided, you know what, you can use the language you want to use, but I'm going to keep it clean.
God forbid. Yes, exactly. God forbid that we use logic when it comes to, and looking at results as opposed to looking at intentions is always something that.
And I'll tell you this, and by the way, and I put this in the press release that the Loudoun Now picked up. The House Democratic Caucus. I'm trying to be partisan here, but this is an actual factual.
We're not a partisan.
Put out
that's fine.
a statement on their priorities for the upcoming. At the time, it was upcoming. It is now the current special legislative session. They mentioned a lot of things our chamber, or officially, and I personally would get behind.
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
So it's not that what they said was wrong.
It's all wrong, right? Yeah.
But what they didn't say was one single syllable on what they were going to do to support the ability of employers to put people back to work and start generating tax revenues that could support all those good things I mentioned just a minute ago. And so I sort of called them out in, my typical civil and professional tone.
You are civil and professional in your tone at all
And
times.
I got one of our 7 delegates. Excuse me, I sent it to 6 because one's not in the Democratic caucus, so I wasn't going to burden him with that communication. But of the other 6, only one got back to me. And got back to me with a sincere offer of, hey, let's talk about it. What can we do? What these things, the rest ignored me, except for one that got back to me 3 weeks later with a thank you for
Thanks for your interest.
Sacked in my office, which again, I won't name names. I'd rather he just ignored me.
I do not think that Democrats in general and people who describe themselves as left of center politically or I think mostly appreciate and understand the value of businesses. I do think the politics has gotten to the point where anything that even appears to support something that might be business related is skewed into something that it's not. And I think
I'm not going to stand by that statement in the general sense, meaning that I believe
we
there are
have
many
some
Democrats that
pro-business
do get it. I do
Yeah.
have many Democrats that own businesses. I can think of there are members of the
But the platforms don't operate that way, right? Look at the national platforms if you want. Most people don't believe a large percentage of what's in the platforms, and a lot of people believe a lot of things that ever make it to the platform.
I think one party didn't even actually have a platform this go around, did they?
Yeah, I heard of that because don't get me started.
Okay.
Well, no, it's not. That shows you how little it actually means.
So I would hope that it would actually be a nonpartisan issue. That putting people back to work.
It should
and
be a
helping
nonpartisan
small
issue.
businesses.
Now, did Virginia's platform reflect Republican platform reflect business? I don't know if you saw that one. Did you see that? I didn't see it.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, you were talking about the Democrat platform at the Virginia.
The House majority.
House majority. Okay.
Yeah.
So there may not be one.
So House Democrats. I don't know. Frankly.
Yeah. Who knows that there is one?
I'm sure that the House minority had one. Minorities usually do. And there's a reason why I'm not aware of it, because very few people are, including maybe members of the House minority.
Yeah, because it's minority.
Because, they do end up, quite frankly, this is not this is true whether Democrats or Republicans are in power.
Sure.
The minority party, just their voice just isn't heard.
There just isn't as heard.
Certainly not proportional to the representation in that legislative body. So
yeah, because it's still almost half and half. Both bodies.
Senates tend to do a better job at that. But even there, it's not always perfect.
Sure. Well, I do think that it is remiss. I mean, I do think it's a bad thing that any political, platform doesn't reflect how jobs are created. I mean, I just think it's a tragedy.
I'm with you, absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming. I really enjoyed having you.
My pleasure. I enjoyed being here.
And for those who are listening or watching, go have a great conversation, but play by the rules.